Africa is not a monolith. It's not a unit of analysis. And I think for all of us up here, we're using Africa here as a shorthand, that they are, sub-Saharan Africa, if you use the World Bank lingo, which Kamal and I are used to doing. It's 47 countries, now 48. But I think that's a really important point, that every time we talk about Africa, it's really a simplistic notion. I think another issue that comes to mind in the area of governance and policy, there's no question that the reason that the economies of most African countries were so resilient during the financial and economic crisis starting in 2008, 2009 is because there were hard-won reforms that were put in place, particularly on the economic side and to some extent in the institutional and the governance side. We certainly see, although there are exceptions as there are in any continent, tremendous improvements in the electoral process across the continent. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. But I think, one cannot deny that there is a direct linkage between the policy making that has taken place and the economic growth that has engendered. It's not been commodity prices. It's not been simply the southern investors like the Chinese or the Indians making that difference. It's because of hard-won fights on the continent itself. Having said that, I think there still is a gross misperception about most African countries. I call it the continent of economic misperceptions, where risks in Africa generally are highly overstated and the investment opportunities are highly understated. That's not the case everywhere in the continent, but a vast majority of the countries, I think that's quite true. One of the things that has been happening, in part more because of southern investors like the Chinese, like the Brazilians, like the Indians, has been that Africa has begun to integrate internationally. And so there's more competition. They are entering, some of the African firms, by dint of southern trade and investment, are beginning to get involved in network trade. And this is engendering competition, more efficiency, climbing the value chain on the continent than otherwise would be the case. And as a result of this new investment, this new trade, this new integration internationally, as has been the case in other emerging markets over centuries, is that this is forcing African civil society, it's forcing African governments, it's forcing African consumers, African businesses to really come under pressure to figure out how are they going to compete even more so, not just with other regions of the world, but among themselves. And so what we're seeing in Africa is much like what I used to see when I was working intensively in China, is you're beginning to see competition among the states in terms of policies. Presidents, prime ministers like to hear of really good stories, robust stories of what worked, in a Tanzania. Gee, can that work, in a Ghana? And they are keeping an eye on each other. And I think that kind of competition is engendering, some degree of improvement in the governance and policy environment. I think, in the context of infrastructure, I think this question of regional integration is so paramount because, as we know, Africa as a continent is cursed by the fact that it is comprised of a large number of small countries. And when that happens, like in other regions of the world, we have to create synthetically large markets so that investors can, whether they're African or not, can yield economies of scale. And what that means is, in terms of the governance arena, particularly in infrastructure where you need to have these interconnections, is how to get the governments to work together so that they can, in tandem, attract the kinds of large-scale investments that investors are going to make because that's the way they make their returns. And I think, this issue of regional integration, with those of us who have been working in Africa for years have been harping on, I think is still the goal. I think it's a laudatory goal, but it's going to take a lot of effort on the part of Africans, on the part of the international community, and frankly, through public-private partnerships on the ground by businesses and investors and those who facilitate investment. And so, you know, at the AU summit in January, there was a call again to try to create a continent-wide free trade area. I think that's great. I think, you know, if you look at where the regional economic communities today on the continent, if you draw them out as I have, it resembles the classic Jagdish Bhagwati spaghetti bowl. Everything is overlapped because virtually every single country in Africa is a member of multiple regional trade associations. And when you talk to investors, as I have, they don't pay attention to these kinds of agreements because they're so spaghetti-like. So I think this goal of creating a single free trade area in Africa is great. But I think we're a long way from there. And I think that issue of regional integration, particularly in the context of infrastructure, is probably one of the key issues on the table.